Welcome to Daily Cheating Stories. We're so glad you're here. Your support means everything to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or hometown in the comments. We'd love to know. Now let's get into today's story. Cheating wife went on a secret date, so I took everything and vanished. Daniel Carter stepped out of his black sedan and into the cool Chicago night, his breath curling into the air as he glanced up at the towering glass facade of his apartment building. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, laughter spilling from the nearby bars, but none of it registered. His mind was clouded, weighed down by an unshakable fatigue that had become all too familiar. Work had been relentless. Another late night buried in spreadsheets and market fluctuations, another evening where his job took priority over everything else. As he entered the building, the warm, well-lit lobby greeted him with its polished marble floors and minimalist decor, yet it felt strangely sterile tonight. The click of his polished shoes echoed eerily in the silence. He took the elevator up to the penthouse, rubbing the tension from his temples, already bracing for the quiet disappointment that had become routine. Lillian would be asleep, he assumed, or lost in one of her endless social media scrolls, indifferent to his absence. But when the doors slid open, he was met with something unexpected. The soft glow of ambient lighting spilled from the apartment, casting a warm hue over the sleek furniture. Lillian stood at the entrance, dressed in a form-fitting black dress he hadn't seen before. Her hair, which she usually kept in loose waves, was styled in an elegant updo, and her makeup was meticulously applied, lips a shade darker than usual. But what struck him most was the perfume, rich, musky, unfamiliar. "You're home late," she said, her tone light but lacking its usual warmth. Daniel blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Yeah, meetings ran over." He stepped closer, leaning in to kiss her, but she turned slightly, offering her cheek instead. A small thing, yet it sent a ripple of unease through him. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked, eyeing her outfit, the clutch in her hand. She hesitated, just for a second, before flashing him a quick, practiced smile. "Just out for a bit? Don't wait up." Daniel watched as she grabbed her coat and brushed past him toward the door. He wanted to say something, to ask a question that would anchor this growing suspicion in something concrete, but the door clicked shut behind her, and he was left alone, staring at the space she had occupied, the scent of that unfamiliar perfume lingering in the air like a ghost. The days that followed felt strangely detached, as if Daniel were watching his own life from a distance. The moment Lillian walked out that night, something had shifted. He couldn't put a finger on it, but the weight of suspicion had lodged itself in his chest like a stone, heavy and unrelenting. It wasn't just the way she had looked, dressed to impress with that unfamiliar perfume, but the way she had spoken, the way she had avoided his touch. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. At first, he told himself he was imagining things. Work stress had been pushing him to the edge, making him overanalyze. But then he started noticing patterns. The late nights became more frequent. Lillian would say she was catching up with friends, going to dinner, or simply needing some time to herself. Daniel had never been the kind of husband to question her independence. He had always trusted her, given her space. But now, something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. The phone calls were the next clue. She had always been on her phone, it wasn't unusual, but now she angled the screen away from him, ended calls abruptly when he walked into the room. He caught glimpses of messages that vanished the moment he got close. Once, in the middle of the night, he stirred awake and found her lying beside him, the glow of her phone illuminating her face as she typed quickly, smiling faintly. When he turned toward her, she locked the screen and pretended to be asleep. Their marriage felt hollow. He hadn't noticed it before, but now, the emptiness between them was suffocating. Lillian used to adore him. He could still remember the way she would light up when he walked through the door, the way she would touch his arm absent-mindedly, as if drawn to him by instinct. But those days were gone. Conversations had turned mechanical, their laughter replaced by silence. And then there was the bedroom. Daniel couldn't remember the last time she had reached for him. Their intimacy had become a relic of the past, something that existed only in memories. Lillian would come to bed late, always too tired, always turned away from him. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was normal, that relationships evolved. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew something was wrong. Yet, he still refused to believe it. Daniel had always been a man who relied on logic, on facts. Emotions could be misleading, suspicions could be irrational, but evidence never lied. And so, despite the part of him that wanted to dismiss his fears as paranoia, he found himself sitting across from Nathan Monroe, a well-known private investigator with a reputation for uncovering the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Nathan was a quiet man, his presence unassuming, his voice calm and steady. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't pry into Daniel's emotions, he simply listened. When Daniel explained the late nights, the secrecy, the unfamiliar perfume, Nathan barely reacted, as if he had heard it all before. "You want confirmation," Nathan said finally, his gaze unwavering. Daniel hesitated. Did he? Or did he want to be proven wrong? "I want the truth," he replied, and so the waiting began. The first few days were torture. Daniel went about his life like a ghost in his own home, watching Lillian move through their apartment with a casual ease that sent a sharp pang through his chest. She laughed at her phone, hummed to herself in the mirror, applied her makeup with meticulous care, but none of it was for him. Every time she stepped out, Daniel's mind raced. He wanted to ask, to demand answers, but what proof did he have? His word against hers? His paranoia against her charming, effortless lies? Nathan kept him updated with brief, professional messages. Following lead. Will update soon. Nothing concrete yet. Patterns are forming. Daniel read each message with his heart pounding, his stomach twisting into knots. And through it all, Lillian grew colder. She no longer even bothered to pretend. Some nights, she didn't come home until after midnight. Others, she showered the moment she walked in, washing away the scent of wherever she had been. When he looked at her, she looked through him, as if he were already gone. Daniel barely slept. His mind churned through scenarios, excuses, possibilities, but deep down, he already knew the truth. He could feel it in his bones. The only thing left was to see it with his own eyes. The envelope sat on Daniel's desk, its contents waiting to dismantle whatever hope remained. Nathan Monroe had called earlier, his voice measured and professional, telling him they needed to meet. Daniel had known what was coming. He had felt it in his bones for weeks, but still, his fingers trembled as he reached for the thick envelope, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. Inside were photographs, timestamps, locations, evidence so damning that there was no room for denial. The first image was taken just 3 nights ago. Lillian, dressed in the same black dress she had worn the night she brushed past him without meeting his eyes. But this time, she wasn't walking out their apartment door. She was stepping into a dimly lit restaurant, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a man Daniel had never seen before. Nathan had written his name on the report. Richard Grant. A successful architect, older than Daniel by at least 15 years, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit that screamed wealth and confidence. Daniel flipped through the photos in silence. Each one chipped away at the life he thought he had. Lillian at dinner with Richard, her head tilted toward him in laughter. Lillian at a hotel bar, sipping wine, her body language unmistakably intimate. And then, the final blow, Lillian disappearing into an upscale hotel with him, hand in hand, her wedding ring noticeably absent. A sharp breath escaped him, his vision blurring as he stared at the undeniable proof of his wife's betrayal. He had told himself for weeks that maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe she was just distant. Maybe she was struggling with something she didn't know how to say. But this was not distance. This was deception. This was a woman who had already replaced him. His hands clenched around the photos, his knuckles white. He felt like he couldn't breathe. How long had this been going on? How many times had she kissed him and then come home, acting as if nothing had changed? How many nights had she lied to his face, looked him in the eyes and told him she loved him? Daniel sat motionless, his entire world tilting on its axis. Everything he thought was real had been a beautifully crafted lie. Daniel sat in his dimly lit office, the stack of photographs still clutched in his hands. He had gone through them a dozen times, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he had misinterpreted something. But there was no room for doubt anymore. It was never just one night. The timestamps stretched back months. Different locations, different outfits, different excuses she had fed him without a flicker of guilt. While he had been drowning in work, coming home exhausted but always faithful, she had been slipping away, one lie at a time. The weight of deception settled heavily on his chest. Lillian had kissed him with the same lips she used to whisper to another man, had held his hand while texting Richard, had looked him in the eye and told him she loved him while planning her next rendezvous. How long had she been preparing to replace him? Had she ever truly felt remorse, or had she convinced herself that he simply wouldn't notice? Daniel's fingers curled around the edges of the photos, his body trembling, not with sorrow, but with something colder. Rage. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before, raw and unfiltered, threatening to consume him whole. He imagined storming home, throwing the evidence in her face, demanding answers that would only confirm the truth he already knew. He imagined shouting, breaking things, shattering the perfect facade she had worked so hard to maintain. But he didn't. A deep breath, controlled and measured, he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. No, this wasn't going to be a scene. This was going to be a reckoning. Confrontation meant nothing if it left him as the broken, betrayed husband begging for an explanation. Lillian wasn't just having an affair, she had already emotionally left him behind. Daniel refused to be the one holding on while she had already moved forward. Instead of rage, strategy took its place. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't fight. He wouldn't give her a single reason to justify her actions. He would simply take away the one thing she had never expected to lose. Him. Daniel moved through the apartment like a ghost, his presence lingering but already fading. He wasn't in a hurry. Every motion was deliberate, every decision carefully calculated. This wasn't an emotional outburst, this was an execution of finality. One by one, he removed his clothes from the closet, neatly folding them into suitcases. The expensive suits she had once complimented, the sweaters she used to steal on cold nights, they would hold no place here anymore. He stripped his side of the dresser clean, emptying every drawer, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling void. The bedroom was next. The place where they had once whispered secrets in the dark, where she had pretended to love him even as she betrayed him. Daniel stared at the bed for a long moment, the sheets neatly made, as if nothing had ever been disturbed. A lie. Just like everything else. He turned away and pulled the photo frames off the walls. Their honeymoon in Italy, weekend getaways, holiday gatherings, all removed with the efficiency of a man deleting an error from his life. He stacked them into a box, but not to take with him. They didn't belong to him anymore. In the living room, he did the same. Every framed memory of their life together, every sentimental object, every trace of who they once were, gone. He left only blank spaces where love had once existed. By the time he finished, the apartment felt empty, lifeless, a reflection of what their marriage had become. Daniel took one last walk through the space, absorbing the silence. He didn't cry. Tears were for men who still believed in what they had lost. He placed his key on the counter, along with a single note. No explanations, no accusations, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had been here once, and now he was gone. Then, without a word, he walked away. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't be another man reduced to anger while she played the victim. Lillian had chosen to live without him long before today. Now, he was making it real. Lillian hummed to herself as she stepped out of the elevator, fishing her keys from her clutch. Tonight had been exhilarating. An expensive dinner, stolen moments in a dimly lit corner booth, whispered promises she had no intention of keeping. Richard had been charming as always, intoxicating in a way Daniel no longer was. She unlocked the door, already rehearsing the excuse she would give Daniel if he was awake. A long dinner with friends. A last-minute work event. Anything would do, he never questioned her. But the moment she stepped inside, something was wrong. The apartment felt different. It took a second for her brain to process it, but then it hit her. The usual warmth, the quiet hum of their life together, it was gone. Completely. Her heels clicked against the floor as she stepped forward, her eyes scanning the living room. The bookshelves were empty. The framed photos, the ones she had barely glanced at for months, were missing. The throw blanket she always found bunched up on the couch was gone, her breath caught. She moved quickly to the bedroom, flipping the light on. Her stomach twisted. The closet, half empty. Daniel's side of the dresser, cleaned out. A strange buzzing filled her ears as she turned in slow circles, her pulse hammering. She grabbed at the nightstand, yanking open the drawers. Nothing. Not a single trace of him. Then she saw it. A single sheet of paper resting on the counter in the kitchen. She stumbled toward it, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. 2 words. I'm gone. The room swayed. No, she whispered, shaking her head as if she could undo this, as if saying it out loud would rewind time. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She called him. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. Her breaths came in short, uneven gasps. She texted him. Nothing. Panic clawed at her chest. Daniel never ignored her, even when she came home late, even when she had been distant, indifferent. He had always been there. But now, he wasn't. Lillian stood frozen in the hollow silence of the apartment, realizing for the first time that she had truly lost him. Lillian sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty closet, the stark absence of Daniel's belongings making the room feel cavernous. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fingers against her temples as if she could force the memories to play in reverse. Rewind. Go back to the beginning. She saw him again, years ago, standing in the pouring rain outside her apartment with a bouquet of wildflowers because he knew she hated roses. She remembered the way his eyes lit up the first time she said she loved him, how he used to pull her close while cooking breakfast, swaying gently to music that only existed between them. There had been so much love, laughter, certainty. So when had it changed? She tried to pinpoint the moment when she had first allowed herself to drift. Maybe it was the long hours Daniel spent at work, the way his conversations started revolving around numbers and investments instead of her. Maybe it was the first time she felt overlooked at a dinner party, watching him charm potential clients while she sat quietly, sipping wine, feeling invisible. Or maybe it had nothing to do with Daniel at all. Maybe it had always been her. She thought she could have both worlds, the security of a husband who would always be there, and the thrill of something dangerous, exhilarating. At first, it had been easy. A small secret, a private indulgence, a harmless flirtation. And then, before she even realized it, she had built an entire life outside of her marriage. A life where Daniel didn't exist. But now, he really didn't. The finality of it hit her like a wave, knocking the breath from her lungs. It wasn't worth it. None of it had been worth it. The stolen nights, the whispered conversations, the meaningless intimacy, all of it had cost her Daniel. And the worst part? He hadn't even fought for her. He had simply left, disappearing as if she meant nothing at all. What had once been a thrill was now a tragedy, and the person responsible was staring back at her from the mirror. Lillian let out a choked breath, pressing her hand against her mouth as the weight of regret settled deep in her bones. Lillian sat across from Nathan Monroe, the private investigator, in a quiet corner of a cafe she barely remembered walking into. The world outside bustled with life, cars honking, people laughing, the city moving forward. But inside, everything felt unnervingly still. She had asked to meet him, hoping for answers, hoping for something, anything, that would make sense of the wreckage of her life. But the moment she looked into Nathan's steady, unreadable eyes, she knew. He knew everything. He slid a single envelope across the table. "What is this?" Lillian whispered, her throat tight. Nathan exhaled, folding his hands over the table. "A letter from your husband." Her breath hitched. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling. The envelope was thick, its weight unsettling. She turned it over, half expecting some cruel, dramatic declaration scrawled across the front, but there was nothing, just her name. Nathan's voice cut through the silence. "Daniel knew before you ever suspected." "He knew, Lillian." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "That's not possible," she said, but the words felt hollow. "It is," Nathan said simply. "He hired me before he ever confronted you in his own mind. He didn't need a confession. He let you dig your own grave." Lillian's heart pounded against her ribs. How long? How long had Daniel been watching her, waiting, letting her go further and further into her own betrayal? Her fingers curled around the envelope, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. She could feel Daniel's presence in it, his silence, his final words, the things he would never say to her in person. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. If he knew, why didn't he say anything? Nathan's gaze was unwavering, because he wanted you to see the truth on your own. The weight of those words crushed her. Daniel hadn't fought. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't begged her to choose him. He had simply walked away, taking everything with him. Lillian swallowed hard, staring down at the envelope as if it might burn her fingertips. The letter in her hands wasn't just a goodbye. It was a verdict, and she already knew what it would say. Lillian sat alone in the silent apartment, the envelope resting in her lap like a bomb waiting to go off. The weight of it was unbearable, heavier than she had expected, as if the paper inside carried every ounce of Daniel's pain, every word sharpened to cut deep. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, unfolding the single sheet of paper. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, just like him. No anger, no accusations, no desperate pleas, just the truth. "Lillian, I thought I knew you. I thought what we built was real, but you weren't the person I believed you to be, and I can't spend another second pretending I don't see you for who you are. You didn't just betray me. You erased me from your life long before I ever left. So I made a choice too. I'm gone, Lillian, and I'm never coming back. No more conversations, no more explanations, no second chances. I've taken everything that was mine. The only thing left is what you chose to destroy. Goodbye." Daniel. Lillian's breath hitched as her eyes ran over the last line, her vision blurring. No second chances. The finality of those words crushed her, stealing the air from her lungs. He had been so certain, so absolute. Her hands tightened around the paper, as if she could squeeze meaning from it, force it to say something different. But it wouldn't change. Nothing would. He was gone. The realization struck like lightning, searing through her chest. She'd been so sure she had time, so sure that if she ever wanted to fix things, if she ever needed to turn back, Daniel would still be there, waiting, forgiving, loving her despite everything. But she had miscalculated. He hadn't fought for her. He hadn't given her a chance to explain, to beg, to twist the story into something that might make her look less cruel. Instead, he had disappeared, taking every trace of himself from her world, his trust, his love, his presence. A broken sob escaped her throat. The letter slipped from her fingers as she collapsed to the floor, her body folding into itself, shaking, breaking. The walls around her seemed to press in, the silence deafening. She had spent so much time chasing something new, something thrilling, only to end up with nothing at all. And for the first time, she truly understood what loss felt like. Because Daniel wasn't coming back. The apartment felt haunted. Lillian sat motionless on the couch, staring at the blank walls, the empty spaces where their life had once existed. The silence was suffocating, a crushing presence that wrapped around her like a vice. Daniel's absence was louder than his presence had ever been. Her phone sat on the table beside her, screen dark, mocking her with its stillness. She had called in more times than she could count, each attempt met with the same cold finality, voicemail. At first, she left messages. "Daniel, please, just call me back. We need to talk." Then, as desperation clawed at her, the words turned frantic. "I know I hurt you. I know I made a mistake, but please, just give me a chance to fix this." Days passed. No response. She sent texts. Long ones, short ones, anything to get through. Nothing. It was as if he had never existed, as if he had erased himself from her life just as effortlessly as she had once erased him from hers. Outside, the city pulsed with life, cars honking, sirens wailing, people moving forward without hesitation. She used to be part of that world, always running toward something exciting, always chasing the next thrill. Now, she couldn't move at all. She stopped answering her friends' messages, ignored invitations she once would have leaped at. None of it mattered. What was the point of dressing up, of pretending, of walking into a crowded restaurant when the one person she truly needed had walked out of her life for good? She picked up her phone again, her fingers hovering over Daniel's name. Still there, but unreachable, her vision blurred as a lump rose in her throat. She typed a message, her last plea. "I don't care if you never forgive me. I just need to hear your voice." She hesitated, then hit send. The seconds dragged, then a minute, then 5. Nothing. Lillian let out a breath, one that felt like it had been trapped inside her chest for weeks. She tossed the phone onto the couch beside her and buried her face in her hands. For the first time in her life, she had nowhere left to run. And the silence that surrounded her was the only answer she was ever going to get. Lillian refused to accept that this was how it ended. Daniel couldn't just disappear. He wasn't the type to walk away without leaving something behind. There had to be a way to find him, to reach him, to make him listen. She spent the next few days reaching out to everyone who might know where he had gone. Mutual friends, old colleagues, even his family. But each conversation left her with the same sinking feeling. I haven't heard from him. He hasn't mentioned anything. If he wanted to be found, don't you think he'd let you know? She tried his office, but he had already put in for leave. No one had any details, no forwarding address, no explanation. He was simply gone. The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. Daniel hadn't just left her. He had erased himself from her entire world. Panic clawed at her chest. She had underestimated him. She had thought he would yell, fight, make a scene, something. But instead, he had done the one thing she never saw coming. He had left without looking back. The weight of that truth settled over her as she stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the sink for balance. The fluorescent light buzzed softly, casting harsh shadows across her face. She forced herself to look up, to meet the gaze of the woman staring back at her in the mirror. Who was she? Her skin looked dull, her eyes hollow, ringed with exhaustion. The confidence, the allure, the intoxicating thrill she had once felt, it was gone. She had thrown away the one person who had ever truly loved her for moments that now felt meaningless. What had she been chasing? What had she really wanted? Lillian reached up, pressing her fingertips to her lips, remembering the last time Daniel had kissed her. Had she already lost him then? Had he already made up his mind to leave, watching her lie to his face and waiting for the moment he would finally let go? A deep, sickening ache spread through her chest. She had done this. And now, no matter how far she searched, how many numbers she dialed, or how many apologies she rehearsed in her mind, Daniel Carter was never coming back. Lillian had spent the last few weeks drowning in regret, clinging to the hope that she could somehow fix what had been broken. But Daniel was gone, and every attempt to reach him led to nothing but silence. So when Richard called, she answered. He suggested dinner at a quiet, upscale restaurant, the same one where they had shared stolen moments, where she had once felt an intoxicating thrill sitting across from him, knowing she was betraying her husband. But now, as she walked into the dimly lit space, nothing about it felt exciting. Richard sat at their usual table, swirling a glass of whiskey between his fingers. He looked up as she approached, flashing the easy, confident smile that had once made her heart race. But tonight she saw something she had been too blind to notice before. He looked ordinary, not exciting, not dangerous, not worth losing everything for. "You're quiet," Richard said, watching her carefully. Lillian forced a smile, but it felt wrong on her face. "Just tired." He nodded, as if that was all the explanation he needed. He talked about his work, about an upcoming project, about everything except her. She sipped her wine, barely listening. The man sitting across from her, the man she had risked everything for, felt like a stranger. And then, between sips of his drink, he said something that made her blood turn cold. "I'm heading to London next week. Long-term project. Might stay for a while." Lillian blinked, her stomach twisting. "What?" Richard sighed, as if explaining something obvious. "I figured you'd understand. We had fun, Lillian, but I never thought you'd get too attached." Her throat went dry. "Too attached?" She stared at him, a sudden wave of humiliation washing over her. Had she really been so stupid? The truth hit her like a slap. She had never meant anything to him. She was just a distraction, a game, something to pass the time. And now that he was done playing, he was moving on. The irony was suffocating. She had sacrificed her husband, her marriage, her entire life for this, for nothing. Lillian sat there, barely breathing, as the truth settled in. She had destroyed everything for a man who had never planned to stay. Lillian sat in the dim light of her apartment, her body sinking into the couch as if she could disappear into it. The silence was deafening. No Daniel, no Richard, just emptiness. She had never felt so alone. For weeks she had been fighting against the inevitable, trying to claw her way back to something, anything that resembled the life she once had. But the truth had settled in now, unshakable and suffocating. There was no way back. Daniel was gone. Richard had walked away without a second thought, and she was left with nothing but the ruins of her own choices. The weight of regret pressed down on her, heavy and unforgiving. The affair had once seemed like an escape, a thrill, something that made her feel alive. But now, in the cold aftermath, all she felt was hollow. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over Daniel's name. Still there, but forever out of reach. Her chest tightened. She had rehearsed what she would say 1,000 times. "I'm sorry. I was selfish. I was wrong." She typed out the words, each one feeling like a plea. "Daniel, I know I don't deserve